The champagne cork popped, echoing like a gunshot through the penthouse. Brian Thorne raised his glass, laughing as he looked out over the city of Seattle. He had done the impossible. He hadn't just divorced Emily. He had destroyed her. He kept the mansion, the stocks, and the reputation, leaving her with nothing but a suitcase and a quiet goodbye. He thought he was the apex predator. He thought he had won the game of life. But Brian made one fatal calculation error. He forgot who Emily's father was. He thought Marcus Sterling was just a retired old man in a wheelchair. He didn't know that Marcus was the man who owned the chessboard Brian was standing on. And the game was just beginning. The fluorescent lights of the King County Superior Courtroom hummed with a low, irritating buzz, but to Brian Thorne it sounded like a choir of angels. He adjusted his silk tie, a Charvet custom weave that cost more than most people's cars, and smirked at the woman sitting at the opposite table. Emily. She looked small. That was the only way to describe her. She wore a simple gray dress that had seen better days. Her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wasn't crying. She wasn't screaming. She was just there. A ghost in the machine of Brian's magnificent rise. "Mr. Thorne," Judge Harrison stated, peering over his spectacles. "Given the prenuptial agreement signed in 2014 and the evidence regarding Mrs. Thorne's lack of contribution to the Thorne Tech conglomerate, the court rules in favor of the plaintiff." Brian let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. His lawyer, a shark named Sebastian Cole from the firm Vanderbilt & Cole, gave him a subtle nod. They had done it. They had successfully argued that Emily, the woman who had supported him when he was coding in a garage, the woman who raised their 2 children while he slept 4 hours a night at the office, was essentially a squatter in his empire. The marital home in Medina, the judge continued, along with the primary custody of the investments and the patent portfolio, will remain with Mr. Thorne. Mrs. Thorne is awarded a lump sum alimony of $50,000 and personal effects. 50,000. It was an insult. It was less than Brian spent on wine and a quarter. Brian turned to look at Emily, expecting devastation. He wanted to see the tears. He wanted to see the regret. After all, she was the one who had become boring. She was the one who refused to attend the galas, preferring to read books in the garden. She was the one who didn't fit his new aesthetic as the CEO of the Pacific Northwest's fastest-growing logistics AI company. He needed a supermodel on his arm, not a librarian. But Emily didn't cry. She slowly stood up. Her eyes, usually a warm hazel, were flat and dark. She looked at the judge, nodded respectfully, and then turned her gaze to Brian. It wasn't a look of anger. It was a look of pity. "Are you happy, Brian?" she asked softly. Her voice wasn't trembling. It was terrifyingly steady. "I'm free, Emily." Brian scoffed loud enough for his lawyer to chuckle. "I'm finally free of the dead weight." "Dead weight," she repeated, tasting the words. "Okay, if that is the narrative you choose." She picked up her purse. "I won't fight the ruling. I just want my father's old chess set, the one in the study." Brian laughed. "The old wooden box. Take it. It smells like mothballs anyway. Just be out of the house by noon tomorrow. Chloe is moving in on Friday, and I don't want your depressing energy lingering in the master suite." The mention of Chloe, his 24-year-old marketing director, was the final twist of the knife. He waited for the explosion. Emily just nodded. "Goodbye, Brian." She turned and walked out of the courtroom. As the heavy oak doors swung shut behind her, Brian felt a rush of adrenaline. He high-fived Sebastian. "Clean sweep, baby." Sebastian grinned. "I told you. The ironclad prenup. We crushed her." "She didn't even fight back," Brian mused, feeling a slight twinge of disappointment. "It was too easy." "She knows she's beaten," Sebastian said, packing his briefcase. "She's a Sterling, sure, but the Sterlings haven't been relevant since the timber industry collapsed in the 90s. Her dad is just some invalid living in a nursing home in Oregon. You're the new money, Brian. You're the king now." Brian walked out of the courthouse and into the blinding Seattle sun. The paparazzi were there, tipped off by his own PR team. He flashed a dazzling smile, the picture of the eligible billionaire bachelor. He pulled out his phone and dialed Chloe. "Pack your bags, babe," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "We won! It's all ours!" He didn't notice the black sedan parked across the street. He didn't notice the window rolled down an inch or the long lens camera that snapped a single photo of his triumphant grin. And he certainly didn't know that the photo wasn't for the tabloids. It was for a dossier. The party 3 days later was obscene. Brian had transformed the Medina estate, a sprawling waterfront property that Emily had spent 5 years lovingly decorating, into a nightclub. The subtle beige tones and antique furniture Emily loved were gone, replaced by flashy neon art and white leather sofas. The bass of the music thumped against the glass walls, vibrating the floorboards. Champagne flowed like water. The elite of Seattle were their tech bros, venture capitalists, Instagram models, and sycophants desperate to be near Brian's aura of success. Brian stood on the balcony, a $4,000 bottle of Cristal in one hand, Chloe draped over the other. She was wearing a dress that left very little to the imagination, giggling at everything he said. "To Brian," shouted Brad, one of Brian's frat brothers, who now worked as his VP of sales. "To the man who trimmed the fat and kept the steak." The crowd roared with laughter. Brian soaked it in. "It's a lesson, boys," he announced, his voice slurring slightly. "Never let sentimentality get in the way of progress. Emily, she was fine for the starter phase. You know, the garage days. But you don't bring a Honda Civic to a Formula One race." More laughter. "What about her dad?" someone asked. "Didn't he help you with the initial loan, Marcus Sterling?" Brian waved his hand dismissively. "Marcus, please. The guy gave me a handshake loan of $50,000 10 years ago. I paid that back with interest in the first 6 months. He's a dinosaur. He sits in that wheelchair staring at trees. I heard he can barely speak a full sentence after his stroke last year. The Sterlings are history. Thorntech is the future." Chloe nuzzled his neck. "You're so bad," she purred. "But seriously, did she really take nothing? Just a chess set?" Brian laughed, taking a swig of the champagne. "Can you believe that, a dusty old board? I told her to take the minivan too, but she called an Uber. Pathetic." Inside the house, the party raged on, but outside the atmosphere was shifting. A sleek vintage Rolls-Royce Phantom, black as midnight, rolled silently up the long driveway. It didn't look like the cars of the other guests' flashy Lamborghinis and Ferraris. This car looked like a tank dressed in a tuxedo. The valet, a college kid named Tim, hesitated. He hadn't seen a car like this before. It didn't have a license plate on the front, just a small silver emblem of a wolf. The back door opened. No driver got out to open it. It opened from the inside. A man stepped out. He was elderly, leaning heavily on a cane made of black polished wood with a silver handle. He wore a suit that looked out of date yet timeless, a 3-piece charcoal wool that fit him perfectly. He wasn't in a wheelchair, despite what Brian had told everyone. It was Marcus Sterling. He looked up at the house. He could hear the bass. He could hear the laughter. He could hear Brian's voice amplifying over the speakers, bragging about his conquest. Marcus didn't look angry. He looked like a man inspecting a building he had decided to demolish. He walked up the steps, bypassing the security guard, who for some reason found himself unable to step in the old man's path. Marcus possessed an aura of authority so heavy it felt like a physical weight. He entered the main hall. The music seemed to die down as people noticed him. He was an anomaly in the sea of glitter and neon. He looked like a ghost from a harder, colder era. Brian, spotting the hush falling over the room, looked down from the balcony. His eyes widened. "Marcus!" Brian shouted, surprised but not scared. He was drunk on power. "Well, well, the ghost of Christmas past. Did you come to beg for more alimony for your daughter? The judge already ruled, old man." The crowd tittered nervously. Insulting an old man felt wrong even for them. Marcus looked up. His eyes were the same hazel as Emily's, but where hers were soft, his were hard as flint. "I did not come to beg, Brian," Marcus said. His voice was raspy quiet, yet it carried through the room without a microphone. "I came to collect." "Collect what?" Brian sneered, leaning over the railing. "I owe you nothing. I made this. I built Thorntech from the ground up." Marcus slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. He didn't read it. He just placed it on the nearest table. "You built nothing," Marcus said calmly. "You assembled the pieces I gave you. You played the hand I dealt you. And now, because you broke the only rule I gave you to honor my daughter, I am folding the table." "You're senile." Brian laughed. "Get him out of here, security." Two burly guards stepped forward, but Marcus simply turned his back on them. He looked at Brian one last time. "Enjoy the champagne, Brian. It's the last bottle you will ever own." With that, Marcus Sterling walked out. He didn't cause a scene. He didn't flip a table. He just left. Brian burst into laughter. "Senile old bat, fold the table." "Who does he think he is?" "The Godfather." "Who was that?" Chloe asked, looking a little uneven. "Emily's dad," Brian said, pouring more drink. "A nobody. Just a nobody trying to scare a giant." But as Brian raised the glass to his lips, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Then it buzzed again. And again. He ignored it. He was partying. 10 minutes later, the music stopped abruptly. Not because the DJ cut it, but because the power to the entire estate cut out. The mansion plunged into darkness. "Who didn't pay the bill?" Brian joked in the dark. But then the whispers started. Guests were checking their phones. "Hey, Brian," Brad said, his voice trembling in the dark. "You might want to check the news." "Why?" Brian snapped, fumbling for his phone. "Because," Brad said, holding up his screen, which illuminated his pale, terrified face. "The SEC just raided the Thorntech offices. And, Brian, the bank just froze the company accounts." Brian froze. "What?" "And Brian," Brad swallowed hard, "check the stock price." Brian unlocked his phone. He opened his trading app. Thorntech Tharin. It wasn't down 5%. It wasn't down 10%. It was trading at $0. Suspended. And right below the notification was an email from the board of directors. The subject line read, "Immediate resignation required." In the darkness of the mansion, he had stolen Brian. Thorne felt the first drop of rain fall on his head, but there was no roof leak. He looked up. The true power had just made its opening move. The darkness in the mansion wasn't just an absence of light. It was a physical weight. The music had died, replaced by the confused murmurs of 200 socialites stumbling over expensive furniture. "Get the lights back on!" Brian screamed, his voice cracking. "Tim, where is the damn valet? Check the breaker!" But nobody moved to help him. The phones that had been recording his glory moments ago were now lighting up the frightened faces of his guests. They weren't looking at him with admiration anymore. They were looking at their news feeds. "Brian!" A voice cut through the dark. It was Brad, his VP. "You need to see this." Brad shoved his phone into Brian's face. The screen was blindingly bright. It was a press release from Sterling Holdings, a company Brian thought had been defunct for 20 years. Sterling Holdings revokes intellectual property license for Thorntech. Cease and desist order issued immediately. "License?" Brian spat. "What license? I wrote the code. I built the AI." "Did you?" The voice came from the front door. Flashlights cut through the gloom, blinding Brian. They weren't the flashlights of partygoers. They were the heavy-duty mag lights of the Medina Police Department. "Brian Thorne," a uniformed officer barked. "Finally." Brian stormed down the stairs, nearly tripping over a discarded champagne bottle. "Officer, arrest that old man. He cut my power. He's harassing me." The officer didn't look at the darkness where Marcus had been. He looked directly at Brian. "Mr. Thorne, I'm going to need you to vacate the premises." Brian froze. Excuse me. This is my house. I won it in court this morning. Check the records. The officer shook his head, pulling a folded document from his vest. We just received a digital writ of possession. According to the King County Deed Registry, the structure, the house itself, is titled to you. However, the land it sits on is owned by the Medina Land Trust. So what? Brian scoffed. I pay the lease on the land. The lease was a 99-year revocable grant. The officer read, granted to Emily Sterling and her family. The clause states that upon the dissolution of marriage to a Sterling, the lease is terminated immediately if the tenant is the non-Sterling party. The room went silent. That's a technicality, Brian roared. My lawyer will fix this in the morning. Maybe, the officer said, his hand resting on his belt. But right now, the owner of the land, Mr. Marcus Sterling, has declared you a trespasser. You have 10 minutes to collect essential personal items and leave. If you refuse, you will be arrested for criminal trespassing. The humiliation was absolute. Brian turned to the crowd, looking for support. This is insane. Can you believe this, Chloe? Tell them. He looked around for Chloe. He found her near the door, illuminated by the flashing red and blue lights of the cruisers outside. She had her suitcase, the one she had packed to move in with, and was dragging it out the door. Chloe! Brian called out, his voice trembling. She stopped and looked back. Her face was a mask of annoyance. Brian, my phone is blowing up. People are saying you're broke, like fraud broke. It's a mistake, a glitch. I can't be associated with this, she said, checking her Uber app. I have a brand to protect. Don't call me. She walked out. The guests followed her like a dam had broken. They streamed past Brian, avoiding eye contact, clutching their purses and phones. The friends who had toasted him 5 minutes ago pushed past him as if he were contagious. 10 minutes, Mr. Thorne, the officer warned. Brian scrambled upstairs. He didn't pack clothes. He didn't pack toiletries. He ran to his safe behind the master bedroom painting. He punched in the code. Error. He punched it in again. Error. System lockdown initiated. No, no, no! Brian slammed his fist against the wall. The safe was SmartTech, ThornTech SmartTech, and if the servers were down, the safe was a brick. He had no cash. His cards were likely frozen. He grabbed his car keys off the dresser, the keys to the McLaren P1. He could sell it. It was worth $1 million easy. He ran downstairs, ignoring the police, and burst out the front door. The rain was pouring now, a classic Seattle deluge. He sprinted to the driveway where the valet had parked the supercar. He hit the unlock button. The lights flashed. He grabbed the handle. But before he could open the door, a tow truck backed into the driveway, blocking him in. Hey! Brian screamed. Get away from my car! The tow truck driver hopped out, holding a clipboard. Repo order. Santander Bank. Payment delinquent. Delinquent, I'm on autopay. Bank froze the account, buddy. Default clause kicks in instantly. Step away from the vehicle. Brian stood in the rain, his tuxedo soaking through his hair plastered to his skull. He watched as his guests drove away in their warm cars. He watched as the tow truck hooked up his McLaren. He watched as the police officer stood by the gate waiting to lock it behind him. He had nothing. No house, no car, no girlfriend, no cash. He began to walk. He walked down the long, winding driveway of the estate he thought he owned. The rain mixed with the tears of rage on his face. He reached the bottom of the hill and pulled out his phone to call Sebastian, his lawyer. Pick up, you shark, Brian hissed. Brian. Sebastian's voice answered. He sounded out of breath. Fix this, Sebastian. Sue them all, Marcus, the police, the bank. I want their heads on pikes. Brian, shut up and listen to me, Sebastian hissed. The lawyer sounded terrified. I can't sue anyone. I'm currently shredding files. What? Why? Because Marcus Sterling didn't just pull the land lease, Sebastian whispered. He just released the Oberon dossier to the FBI. Brian, they know about the stolen source code. They know about the offshore accounts in the Caymans where you were hiding the marital assets. And they know I helped you set them up. Brian stopped walking. The cold rain felt like ice in his veins. You're on your own, Brian, Sebastian said. Do not contact this office again. The line went dead. Brian Thorne stood on the side of the road in the pouring rain, the reception bars on his phone dropping to 0 as the battery died. The next morning, Brian looked like a derelict. He had spent the night in a 24-hour diner nursing a single cup of coffee he paid for with the loose change he found in his tuxedo pocket. He hadn't slept. His eyes were bloodshot, his stubble was rough, and his silk suit was stained and wrinkled. At 8:00 a.m. sharp, he stormed into the lobby of Thorne Tech. "Mr. Thorne," the receptionist gasped. She looked at him with a mixture of horror and pity. You can't be here. Security has been alerted." "I am the CEO." Brian slammed his hand on the desk. "I own this building. I own you." "Actually," a calm voice came from the elevators. "You don't." Brian spun around. Standing there was Emily. She wasn't wearing the drab gray dress from the courtroom. She was wearing a sharp navy power suit, her hair pulled back in a sleek bun. She looked vibrant, alive. Beside her was a man Brian didn't recognize, a heavy-set man with thick glasses and a tablet. "Emily," Brian breathed. "What are you doing here? Did you come to gloat?" "I came to work," Emily said simply. "Work? You don't work here. You're a housewife." "Brian!" Emily sighed, stepping closer. "Let's go to the conference room. We need to explain the reality of your situation before you embarrass yourself further." Brian followed them, mostly because 2 security guards men he had hired were now standing behind Emily, looking at him like he was a threat. They entered the glass-walled boardroom. The view of Seattle was gray and rainy. Emily sat at the head of the table, his seat. "Sit," she commanded. Brian sat. "This is illegal, Emily. Whatever Daddy did, it won't stick. I built the code. DeepMind logic is my invention." The man with the glasses spoke up. "Incorrect. DeepMind logic is a derivative fork of the Sterling 4 algorithm." "Who is this guy?" Brian snapped. "I'm Dr. Eris Thorne," the man said. "No relation. I'm the forensic code auditor hired by the board." Emily folded her hands on the table. "Brian, do you remember when we first met in the coffee shop near the university? You were struggling with your thesis." "So what?" "You were stuck," Emily said. "You couldn't get the neural net to process unstructured data. You were going to fail." "I fixed it," Brian insisted. "I had a breakthrough." "No," Emily shook her head. "I fixed it. While you were sleeping. I wrote the patch. I integrated my father's old logic sequences from his timber logistics software systems he designed in the 80s to track millions of logs across the globe. It was the most efficient routing algorithm in history." Brian stared at her. He remembered waking up and finding the code working. He had assumed he did it in a fugue state. He had taken the credit. "I let you believe you did it," Emily said softly. "Because I loved you, and I wanted you to feel powerful. My father knew, of course. He recognized his own syntax in your beta release. He wanted to sue you then. I begged him not to. I told him we were a team." "So..." Brian's mouth felt dry. "The IP, it's yours." "It's the Sterling Trust's," Emily corrected. "And here is the problem, Brian. When we were married, the trust granted Thorne Tech a license to use the code for $1 a year. It was a wedding gift." She slid a piece of paper across the table. "This is the licensing agreement. Clause 7A. In the event of a divorce initiated by the licensee Brian Thorne against the beneficiary Emily Sterling, the license is retroactively revoked unless the beneficiary retains 50% of the company." Brian felt the room spin. "Retroactively." "Retroactively," Dr. Eris confirmed. "Since the divorce was finalized yesterday and you took 100% of the company, the license is void going back to day one. You have been using stolen software for 10 years. That means, Emily said, her voice dropping an octave, that every dollar Thorn Tech has ever made, every contract, every government grant, every stock dividend is actually proceeds from stolen property. You don't just owe the company money, Brian. You owe the Sterling Trust approximately $1.2 billion in back pay royalties. Brian slumped in his chair. I can't pay that. I'm bankrupt. We know, Emily said. That's why the board has voted to restructure. Restructure? The company is being acquired, Emily said, by Sterling Holdings for the price of the outstanding debt. You're stealing my company, Brian whispered. I'm repossessing my father's code, Emily said, standing up. And since you are the CEO who oversaw this massive copyright infringement, the SEC has barred you from holding a corporate officer position for life. You're fired, Brian. Brian looked at her truly, seeing her for the first time in years. He didn't see the boring housewife. He saw the daughter of a titan. He saw the woman who had quietly held up the sky while he strutted around underneath it. Why? Brian asked, his voice breaking. Why wait until now? Why let me build it all up just to tear it down? Emily walked to the door. She paused, her hand on the handle. I didn't want to tear it down, Brian. I was happy to let you be the king. All I asked for was kindness. All I asked was that you didn't erase me. She looked back at him, her eyes cold. But you wanted a total victory. You wanted to leave me with nothing. You forgot the first rule of chess, Brian. What's that? He whispered. Protect your queen, she said, because she's the most powerful piece on the board. She opened the door. Security will escort you out. Brian was led out of the building he built, past the employees who refused to look at him. He was shoved out onto the sidewalk, back into the rain. But the nightmare wasn't over. As he stood there shivering, a black town car pulled up. The window rolled down. It wasn't Marcus. It was Sebastian, his lawyer. But Sebastian wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing a wire. And behind the town car were 3 black SUVs with government plates. Agents and FBI windbreakers stepped out, moving with purpose. They weren't coming for the company. They were coming for the man. Brian realized then that losing his money was just the opening act. The true power Marcus Sterling wielded wasn't financial. It was the ability to dig up the bones Brian had buried deep in the desert. One of the agents approached him, handcuffs glinting in the gray light. Brian Thorn, the agent said. We need to talk about the Velicor project. Brian's knees buckled. Velicor, the one illegal thing he had done that had nothing to do with Emily. Or so he thought. The interrogation room at the FBI Seattle field office was not designed for comfort. It was a windowless cube painted a suffocating shade of beige, smelling of stale coffee and fear. Brian Thorn sat at the metal table, his wrists handcuffed to a bolt in the floor. The designer suit he had worn to reclaim his company was now rumpled and sweat-stained. He had been sitting there for 3 hours. No water, no phone call, no lawyer. Finally, the door buzzed and swung open. 2 people walked in. The first was Special Agent Miller, a woman with eyes like ice picks and a file folder thick enough to stop a bullet. The second person made Brian's blood run cold. It was Sebastian Cole, his lawyer, the man he had paid millions to protect him. Sebastian? Brian lunged forward, the chain on his cuffs snapping him back. Thank God, get me out of here. Tell them who I am. This is a misunderstanding about the IP rights. It's a civil matter. Sebastian didn't look at him. He pulled out a metal chair and sat down on the far side of the table next to Agent Miller. He placed a recorder on the table. Sebastian, Brian whispered. Mr. Cole is not here as your counsel, Mr. Thorn, Agent Miller said, opening the file. He is here as a cooperating witness under a federal immunity deal. The air left the room. Immunity? Brian stammered. For what? We didn't do anything illegal. We were aggressive, sure, but... Project Velicor, Agent Miller interrupted. She slid a photo across the table. It was a grainy surveillance photo of Brian meeting with a man in a park. Brian recognized the man immediately, Viktor Volkov, a consultant based in Cyprus. Velicor wasn't just a data optimization project, was it, Brian? Agent Miller asked. It was a backdoor. Brian's mouth went dry. I don't know what you're talking about. We know you modified the Sterling 4 source code, Miller continued. Emily Sterling's code was designed for logistics moving goods efficiently, but you tweaked it. You turned it into a predictive behavioral algorithm. You used Thorntech's consumer apps to record audio from users' phones even when the apps were closed. You harvested keywords, banking passwords, affair details, health data. That's for ad targeting, Brian argued, his voice shrill. Everyone does it. Everyone gathers metadata, Miller corrected. Not everyone packages the raw audio files and sells them to foreign intelligence brokers in Cyprus. That's not marketing, Brian. That's espionage. That's treason. Brian looked at Sebastian. You told them. Sebastian finally looked up. He looked tired but resolved. Brian, when you told me to set up the Cyprus accounts, you said it was for tax avoidance. I can live with tax fraud, but when I saw the transfer logs last week, when I saw who was paying us, I couldn't do it. I'm not going to prison for treason. You coward! Brian screamed. I paid for your house. I paid for your boat. And you paid for it with blood money, Sebastian said quietly. But here's the part you don't get, Brian. I didn't go to the FBI first. What? I went to Marcus Sterling. Brian froze. I went to him 2 days ago, Sebastian explained. I was terrified. I thought he would destroy me. But he didn't. He looked at the evidence and he told me exactly what to do. He told me to let you win the divorce case. He told me to let you have the party. He wanted you to feel untouchable. Why? Brian rasped. Why wait? Because, Agent Miller interjected, Marcus Sterling wanted to see how far you would go. He gave you the rope, Mr. Thorne, and you hanged yourself. She flipped a page in the file. The buyer in Cyprus, Viktor Volkov. Miller smirked. He's not Russian intelligence. He's a CIA asset. We've been running him for 3 years. Every file you sold, every byte of data you thought you were smuggling out, it came straight to us. Brian stared at the table. The reality of the trap was suffocating. So, Brian whispered, it was a sting the whole time. Not the whole time, Miller said. Only since Marcus Sterling called us 6 months ago. He suspected you were misusing his daughter's code. He asked us to monitor you. He authorized the operation. Marcus? Brian shook his head. He's a timber merchant. He sells wood. He doesn't have the clearance to authorize a CIA operation. Agent Miller exchanged a look with Sebastian. It was a look of pity. Mr. Thorne, Miller said, leaning in, you really didn't do your due diligence when you married into that family, did you? Marcus Sterling didn't just sell timber. In the 1970s and 80s, Sterling Logistics was the primary contractor for the Department of Defense. Who do you think moved the ICBM silos? Who do you think designed the supply chains for the stealth bomber program? Brian felt sick. He remembered the old man in the wheelchair, the quiet gardener he had mocked. He retired in '98, Miller said. But in our world, men like Marcus Sterling never retire. They just go dormant. You woke a sleeping giant Brian. And worse, you broke his daughter's heart. That made it personal. The door buzzed again. A guard stepped in. Transport is here, the guard grunted. Transport to where? Brian asked, panic rising. I want bail. I have rights. Bail is denied for flight risks and national security threats, Miller said, closing the file. You're being moved to the Federal Detention Center in SeaTac. You'll await trial there. She stood up. Oh, and Mr. Thorne, one last thing. The assets you tried to hide in the Caymans, the government has seized them. But the Thorntech shares, since they were based on stolen IP, they've been returned to the original licensor. Emily, Brian whispered. She's a billionaire again, Sebastian added, standing up to leave. And she's already announced she's liquidating the company. She's donating the entire proceeds to digital privacy charities. She's burning it down, Brian said, tears stinging his eyes. My legacy. Your legacy, Sebastian said, pausing at the door, is a cautionary tale. 2 weeks later, the federal detention center was a gray purgatory. Brian had lost 15 pounds. His hair was shorn close to his scalp, replacing his perfectly styled cut. He wore an orange jumpsuit that chafed his skin. He spent his days staring at the concrete wall, replaying the last 10 years in his mind. Where had it gone wrong? Was it the first time he ignored Emily? The first time he cheated? The first time he decided that he was the genius and she was just the accessory? Thorne, a guard, banged on the bars. Visitor. Brian didn't look up. Tell my public defender to go away. I'm pleading guilty. I just want it to be over. Not your lawyer, the guard said. Move it. Brian was handcuffed and led down the long, echoing hallway to the visitation room. It was a row of booths with thick plexiglass dividers. He sat down. On the other side of the glass, sitting perfectly upright in a wheelchair, was Marcus Sterling. Brian hadn't seen him since the night of the party, the night the lights went out. Marcus looked healthy, strong. He wore a tweed jacket and a flat cap. He didn't look like a man who had destroyed an empire. He looked like a grandfather visiting a park. Brian picked up the phone receiver. His hand was shaking. Marcus picked up his side. Hello, Brian, Marcus said. His voice was calm, devoid of malice. You came to gloat, Brian asked, his voice hoarse. You won. I'm in a cage. Is that enough for you? I don't gloat, Marcus said softly. Gloating is for people who are insecure about their victory. I am simply tidying up. Tidying up. Brian laughed, a harsh, broken sound. You ruined my life. You set me up with the feds. You took my company. I took back what you stole, Marcus corrected. And I stopped you from doing more damage. You were selling people's lives, Brian, innocents. You were selling their secrets for a new yacht. Did you really think I would let that stand? I was a businessman, Brian snapped. I was doing what I had to do to stay on top. You don't understand the pressure. I understand pressure, Marcus said, his eyes narrowing. I had nuclear codes moving through my trucks in 1982. Do not talk to me about pressure. You were greedy. That is not pressure. That is a character flaw. Marcus leaned forward, his face close to the glass. I came here to tell you something, Brian. Something Emily doesn't even know. A secret. Brian hesitated. What? The code, Marcus said. The logic sequence Emily wrote, the one you stole. Do you know why I never patented it? Why I kept it locked in a wooden box? Because you were old-fashioned, Brian sneered. No, Marcus said. Because it was dangerous. Brian frowned. Dangerous? It's logistics software. It's an optimization engine, Marcus explained. It optimizes any system it is given. Supply chains, traffic, or human behavior. When I built the prototype in the 90s, I realized that if you fed it enough data, it didn't just predict what people would do. It began to manipulate them. It showed them things to make them act in ways that made the system more efficient. Brian felt a chill. The engagement metrics, the addiction rates on the app, they were off the charts. Exactly. Marcus nodded. The AI was manipulating your users, making them angry, making them sad just to keep them clicking, to keep the data flowing. I shut it down 30 years ago because I saw it was a weapon. I taught Emily to code, but I never told her the core function. I thought she would just use it for her puzzles. Marcus sighed. Then you came along, you stole it, and you connected it to the internet. You didn't just build a company, Brian. You built a mind control engine, and you were too stupid to realize it. Brian sat back, stunned. I didn't know. Ignorance is not a defense, Marcus said sternly. It is an indictment. You played with fire because you liked the way it sparkled. You burned down everything around you. So what happens now? Brian asked, his voice small. Does Emily have it? Emily destroyed it, Marcus said. Yesterday, she wiped the servers. She physically smashed the hard drives with a sledgehammer. She is stronger than you, Brian. She saw the power and she rejected it. You saw the power and you worshipped it. Marcus began to wheel himself back from the glass. Wait! Brian cried out, pressing his hand to the glass. Marcus stopped. Why? Brian swallowed hard. Why did you let me marry her, if you knew who I was? Marcus turned his chair. He looked at Brian with a profound sadness. I didn't know who you were, Brian. I knew you were ambitious. I knew you were hungry. But I hoped that Emily's love would be enough to fill that hole in you. I hoped you would choose family over power. Marcus adjusted his cap. I was wrong. That is my sin. And this... He gestured to the prison walls. This is your penance. What about Emily? Brian asked. Does she hate me? Marcus paused. Hate requires energy, Brian. Emily doesn't hate you. She has forgotten you. She's going back to school next week. She wants to be a teacher. She's finally happy. Marcus hung up the phone. He didn't look back. He wheeled himself out of the room, the heavy metal door clanging shut behind him. Brian sat alone in the booth. He looked at the phone receiver in his hand. The line was dead. He slowly hung it up. For the first time in his life, Brian Thorne understood the true nature of power. Power wasn't money. It wasn't fame. It wasn't code. Power was the ability to walk away, and he was the only one left in the room. 5 years is a long time in the outside world. In the world of technology, it is an eternity. Entire programming languages rise and fall in 5 years. Startups become empires, and empires become dust. But inside the Federal Correctional Institution in Sheridan, Oregon, 5 years is just a single elongated day. Brian Thorne, once the man who claimed to own the future, was now inmate 79402B. The bespoke Italian suits that had once defined his silhouette were replaced by ill-fitting khaki uniforms that smelled of industrial detergent and despair. The hands that had once signed multi-million-dollar contracts now spent 6 hours a day sorting paperbacks in the prison library. It was a Tuesday in November, a gray, weeping day that matched the color of the concrete walls. Brian pushed his cart down the aisle of the fiction section, straightening the spines of dog-eared thrillers. He had become obsessive about the library. It was the only thing left in the world he could control. If a book was out of place, he fixed it. It was a pathetic shadow of the control he once wielded, but it was all he had. "Thorne!" A voice grunted from the doorway. It was Officer Higgins, a man who took a distinct pleasure in reminding the former white-collar elite that they were now at the bottom of the food chain. "Donation box came in from the Portland Charity Drive," Higgins said, kicking a cardboard box across the linoleum floor. "Sort it, and don't let me catch you reading the good stuff." Brian nodded silently. He didn't argue anymore. The Brian who screamed at valets and belittled waitresses had died somewhere around his 3rd month in solitary confinement. He sat on a plastic stool and began slicing open the box. It was the usual dross romance novels with torn covers, outdated encyclopedias, and a stack of magazines that were months old. He flipped through the stack of magazines, tossing them into piles. National Geographic, Reader's Digest, Forbes. He paused at the Forbes. His hand hovered over the glossy cover. He hadn't touched a business magazine in 4 years. It was too painful. It was like looking at photos of a lover who had died. But something compelled him to pick it up. It was dated from 2 months ago. The headline was bold, embossed in gold lettering, "The Quiet Titan, How the Sterling Trust Saved the Ethical Internet." And there she was. Brian's breath hitched in his throat. It was Emily. She looked different. Older, yes, but the years hadn't worn her down. They had polished her. She wasn't wearing the drab, invisible clothes she used to wear when they were married. She wore a sharp white blazer, her hair cut in a chic, confident bob. She looked powerful. Not the aggressive, loud power Brian had chased, but a serene, immovable power, like a mountain. He opened the magazine, his fingers trembling so hard the pages crinkled. He needed to read it. He needed to know. The article was a dissection of the last 5 years. It detailed how Emily Sterling had taken the wreckage of Thorn Tech, a company branded as a spyware factory, and dismantled it. She had exposed the Velocore algorithm, working with international watchdogs to create new laws for digital privacy. But the knife in Brian's heart came in the third paragraph. While the disgraced founder Brian Thorne serves a 12-year sentence for espionage and fraud, his ex-wife has emerged as the true genius behind the code. Industry experts now refer to the period of Thorne's leadership as the glitch, a temporary error in the system that was corrected by the return of the Sterling legacy. The glitch. Brian whispered the words, tasting like ash. He wasn't a villain. He wasn't a mastermind. To history, he was just a glitch, a bug in the code that Emily had patched out. He read on. The article mentioned that Emily had remarried a pediatric surgeon. They had a child on the way. She was happy. She was whole. She had built a life that didn't just exclude him, it erased him. Brian closed the magazine. He felt a physical pain in his chest, a hollowing out of his soul. For years he had told himself that she was nothing without him, that she was just a Sterling daughter living off Daddy's money. But the truth was staring him in the face. He had been the parasite. She was the host. Thorne mail call. Brian jumped. Officer Higgins was back, holding a small brown paper package. For me, Brian asked, his voice raspy from disuse. Don't get excited. Probably legal paperwork. Higgins tossed the package onto the cart. Lights out in 20. Brian took the package back to his cell. It was small, heavy for its size, and wrapped in expensive textured paper. The return address was simply the Sterling Estate, Medina. Brian sat on the edge of his thin mattress. His heart hammered against his ribs. Was it from Emily? Had she sent him a photo, a final goodbye? He tore the paper open. Inside was a small wooden box polished to a shine, smelling faintly of cedar and old memories. There was a letter folded neatly on top. The handwriting was shaky, the script of a man whose nerves were failing him. It wasn't Emily's handwriting. It was Marcus. Brian unfolded the letter. The date at the top was from 3 weeks ago. Brian, if you are reading this, I am gone. The doctors tell me the stroke took too much this time. I am settling my accounts, clearing my desk. I do not like leaving loose ends. I debated whether to send this to you. Part of me, the angry father part, wanted to let you rot in silence. But Emily, she is better than me. Even now she asked if I had forgiven you. I told her that forgiveness is God's business. My business is logistics. I am sending you this because I want you to understand why you lost. You sit in that cell thinking you were outsmarted, or that you were unlucky, or that I pulled strings you couldn't see. All of those things are true, but they are not the reason you failed. You failed because you do not understand the game you were playing. Enclosed is the king from my grandfather's chess set, the one you laughed at, the one you said smelled of mothballs. Look at it, Brian. Brian set the letter down and opened the wooden box. Inside, resting on black velvet, was the king piece. It was hand-carved from dark walnut, heavy and solid, but it was damaged. The intricate cross atop the crown had been snapped off, leaving a jagged, raw scar in the wood. He picked it up. It felt cold. He went back to the letter. A novice player looks at the king and sees the most important piece. He thinks the game revolves around the king's survival. He sacrifices his pawns, his knights, and even his queen to keep the king safe. But a grandmaster knows the truth. The king is the weakest piece on the board. He is slow. He can only move one square at a time. He cannot attack from a distance. He is entirely dependent on the pieces around him for protection. A king without his queen, without his bishops, without his army is just a piece of wood waiting to be toppled. You treated Emily like a pawn, Brian. You sacrificed her to save your ego. You didn't realize that she was the queen. She was the piece that could move in any direction, the piece that held the board together. When you discarded her, you didn't free yourself. You exposed your throat. I broke the crown off this piece 40 years ago, the night I almost lost my own wife, because I was too busy building my company. I kept it on my desk as a reminder. A king who stands alone is already broken. Keep it. Let it remind you of the difference between power and value. You had power, Brian, but you had no value. Checkmate. Marcus Sterling. Brian lowered the letter. The silence of the prison cell was deafening. He looked at the broken king in his hand. He ran his thumb over the jagged wood where the crown used to be. For 5 years he had harbored anger. He had plotted revenge fantasies where he would get out, start a new company, and crush the Sterlings. He had told himself he was the victim of a conspiracy. But as the words of the dying old man sank in, the anger evaporated, leaving only a cold, hard clarity. He saw the courtroom again. He saw Emily's face, not angry, but pitying. She hadn't been looking at a powerful tycoon. She had been looking at a defenseless king who had just sent his army away. He had bragged about winning the divorce. He had bragged about keeping the house. He had thrown a party on the precipice of his own destruction, drinking champagne while the ground beneath him crumbled. Brian stood up. He walked to the small polished steel mirror bolted to the wall over his sink. He looked at his reflection, the gray stubble, the hollow eyes, the number printed on his chest. He placed the broken king on the metal shelf right next to his plastic toothbrush. "The glitch," he whispered to his reflection. The lights in the cell block flickered a warning buzz, signaling the nightly lockdown. The heavy steel doors of the distant cells began to slam shut one by one, a rhythmic booming that sounded like a gavel coming down over and over again. Brian didn't look away from the chess piece. It was the only inheritance he would ever receive. It was the only truth he had ever been told. He sat back down on his cot, folded his hands, and waited for the darkness to take him. The game was over. And that is where the story of Brian Thorne ends. He spent his life trying to become a king, only to realize too late that a king without a queen is just a target. It's a brutal lesson, but a necessary one. Arrogance is a blindfold. Brian was so busy looking in the mirror, admiring his own reflection, that he didn't see the cliff edge he was walking toward. Marcus Sterling didn't destroy Brian with money or lawyers. He destroyed him with the truth. He simply let Brian have exactly what he asked for: total isolation, and let the weight of that crush him. What do you guys think? Was Marcus's final lesson with the chess piece an act of cruelty, or was it the ultimate act of mercy, giving Brian the truth he needed to hear? And if you were Emily, would you have forgiven him? Or did she do the right thing by erasing him completely? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read through them after every upload, and I'd love to see your take on the broken king theory. If this story kept you hooked, please hit that like button. It really helps the algorithm share these stories with more people. And if you want more deep dives into stories of justice, karma, and the dark psychology of power, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. Thanks for watching. And remember, be careful who you sacrifice to win the game. You might just find yourself playing alone. See you in the next one.